folksy folks. My name is Vanessa Y. Rogers, and I am your hostess of the Fabric of Folklore podcast. And this is the podcast where we unravel the mysteries of folklore. And on this podcast, we love stories, we love folk tales, but we don't just want the surface level. We want to really dig deep. We want to have context to better understand, to have better clarity. We want to understand the history and significance of the folk tales and traditions that we're learning about. And so that's really what this podcast is all about. It's kind of like when you go to a museum and you see a painting and it's beautiful and you can admire its beauty, but when you understand the history behind it, it gives you a much stronger connection. The example I found recently that I thought was really neat was the creation of Adam is one of Michelangelo's most iconic works, and it's in the Sistine Chapel, and concealed within the robes and faces of the figure of God is a representation of the human brain. And many people think that it was Michelangelo's attempt at a covert attack on the church's attack on science. And so when you have these understandings of these stories and this art and music, then we just have a stronger connection. So if this sounds like a podcast that you are interested in, please subscribe, please review, please give us all the stars, because it really helps a burgeoning podcast like ourselves to have those reviews and have those stars so that other people understand that this is a really cool podcast that they should give a try. And we have such a fun topic for you today. We're going to be diving into Maine folklore again. Some of you will remember the podcast that we had with Michelle E. Shores, who talked about the ghost of Nellie Butler. And today we're going to be talking about a different Maine folklore, fearsome critters, strange beasts, both wonderful and terrifying. That I'm going to be butchering some words here, so I apologize in advance. The Abenaki are the first people who had their tales of Glooskap and Pomola, I think is how you say it. And other tales came from the European settlers, and others sprang up almost out of nothing around the fires of logging camps. Our guest today is Christopher Packard. He's the author of Mythical Creatures of Maine, and is a full-time high school science teacher. He's also a trail runner, a sword fighter, a storyteller, an outdoor adventurer, and a homesteader. He has worked as an ecological restoration technician, a field biologist, naturalist, and an outdoor educator. He has degrees in biology and education, but he feels that most of his learning came from his passion for discovery and his drive to bring people together. So welcome to the show, Fabric of Folklore. Christopher, we're so glad to have you.
Hi, thanks for having me. I appreciate the invite.
And like I was saying before, one of the things that I really like to do is to have a better context of our guests is to ask them a little bit about their history. And the first thing that came up for me is sword fighting. Tell us a little bit more about some of these hobbies. These sound so fascinating. Sword fighting, storytelling, homesteading. Tell us about these things.
Yeah, well, I think I just have too many interests. So the sword fighting that I do in college, I did some like sport fencing, like on the Olympics with not in the Olympics, obviously, but with foil and epee. But recently I've been more engaged with the Society for Creative Anachronism and doing historic like recreation of Western martial arts with like a rapier, like a Three Musketeers sword. And so I've always really been interested in like sort of like ancestral like things and ways of being, and just to like understand our stories and like where we come from and who we are. Like, I think it's really cool to like be able to step back and like do some of that old stuff, like farming on my homestead.
Mm-hmm.
We raise a lot of our own food. We butcher animals. We, do all that. We do a lot of music at my house, as you might be able to tell, though I'm not the musical one in the family.
Is it your wife or your children?
Yes, all of them, but not me. So I have the gift of words and not music so much. So,
but you can appreciate their music.
Oh, very much so. And I mean, that's one of the greatest folk traditions, and so I just throw words at things since I don't have music to throw into it. So.
Well, do you help them write lyrics for their music, or do they write their own music, or do they just recreate other people's music?
Yeah, both my wife and my oldest son are both really great songwriters, and my youngest is trying to figure out what his interest is exactly. But there's a lot of songwriting, and my skills are not usually called upon for that. That's
They're useful elsewhere.
absolutely.
Well, and so give us a little bit of background on your previous experience. So you were an ecological restoration technician, a field biologist, a naturalist, an outdoor educator. How did this all feed into this your interest of Maine folklore?
Yeah, so well, I was a biologist, and I guess I still am a biologist. I'm a full-time science teacher, high school science teacher, and previous to that, though, I worked as like a field ecologist and botanist, and did surveys and things like that. And I spent a lot of summers in Maine with my grandfather, and he had some great stories about these sort of, he was a great woodsman, a guide, a trapper, and kind of the Yankee ingenuity of doing like everything to make ends meet. And, he had these fascinating stories about some like pretty ridiculous creatures sometimes and kind of scary creatures sometimes. And I just thought he was making all these up. And but I loved it, and I got real. Nature is just such an important part of my life, and being out there. And I decided to study it and talk about it and teach about it. And I really didn't think anything about like these creatures, though. Like interests in like Bigfoot and Loch Ness monster and like my grandfather's creatures were certainly some of the things that were like faces of nature that
Mm,
brought me to that, and sort of kept me there and helped me have like a relationship with nature,
mm,
with through these stories and these creatures, and the idea that the unknown is out there and that there's like all these mysterious things just waiting to be discovered. And I stumbled across an old folklore book in a thrift store, and I saw these stories, some of which featured creatures that my grandfather had told me decades ago, and I was like, wow, I thought Grampy was just making those up. And so my wife says I became a little bit obsessed. I would have like wake up and do the coffee and creature hunting in like old books and newspapers and
mhm,
magazines, and
mhm.
I'd get in these conversations with these old timers and talk to all sorts of people about them, and just made this big collection. And she's like, you should do something with that. And in my mind I was doing something, but it was a pretty good idea. So put it into a book, and and that's Mythical Creatures of Maine. And it kind of like linked it, in one type of creature led to other types of creatures. And so you mentioned like there's the Native American people in Maine are the Wabanaki, and the Abenaki is like an old fashioned term for them that is one of the groups of the Wabanaki, and they have all sorts of stories. And of course, they were lumberjacks and guides and hunters, and
Mhm.
talked to people like my grandfather, my grandfather's grandfather, and the stories all kind of blended together. And so like originally I was just going to tell stories about like these guide creatures, and they just started getting connected to like modern cryptids and Native American creatures. And so I wanted to like it was like Pokemon, I wanted to collect them all, and tell about them, because you really couldn't tell one story often without referring to
Mm,
something else.
mhm,
And the way that folklore and oral tradition works is it's all just like woven together into like a tapestry that like you can't, the one thread doesn't mean anything. It's like how all these cultures meet. And Maine is just such a really cool place with this like melting pot of cultures. There's
mhm,
of course the first people, the Wabanaki, the Five Nations of them, and then the French Acadians settled here, and then the English came, and then the Canadians, like from Quebec, came, which was a different pulse, and the Irish and the Scottish came, and all those stories, and even like Swedish people and Norse people came, and those stories like wove together and changed as these people met, and stories passed from one generation to another. And it's just become really fascinating to really track down these stories. And every time I think I'm done finding all the stories, there's like a million more. And they're like, so many of them are still alive
mhm.
and or have changed. And when I started, I was really obsessed with this idea of like the true nature, like what was the original one, but that's not really the important thing in folklore. But I got like way off what we were talking about. You asked me about biology, but I'm a biologist who loved nature and heard these stories and was like, how do these connect, and like why are these important? And those are the questions that have been rattling around in my head.
Are there similar
So
questions that you might ask as a biologist?
yeah, they're absolutely the questions I ask. And so like my students, these young people that I'm working with every day, talking about like, logical thinking and evidence-based thinking, and like what it means to be real and how do we verify something is, and like what, why questions is something that science doesn't do great at. It's very good about like delving in and finding details, and I think my science mind has really, encouraged me to look at these things in a very, sort of agnostic, open-minded way, because science never, disproves anything. It just collects evidence that like leads to like verification, but there's no like evidence that something doesn't exist. Like lack of evidence isn't proof that it's not out there. So, I'm not saying
Yeah.
like these creatures are necessarily out there in a biological sense, but they're very real and they're alive, and they're a really important part of, at very minimum, our culture, but also maybe our relationship with the way we interact not only with each other in culture, but with the world around us. Like there's cautionary stories in these tales, and there's like, some lessons to be learned about how nature works and what you got to watch out for and how to get along with things, and how to respect things and what to watch out for. So
Can I go back to the where you say that science doesn't answer the why question very well? Can you talk a little bit about that? I'm not familiar with that.
yeah, so like it people often want to know like why did it turn out that way, and like there is no like why other than like it worked, and so it continued to be passed on. Like there's it the why is only just like because it is effective at passing itself on in that way, basically in a biological sense. You've got like this idea, you can make a hypothesis about anything and then you collect evidence to support it, and you might have like a more verified hypothesis that this statement of like what I think is going on. Science answers questions about like what is happening, and like maybe being able to have like predictive things, but then it's at its nature like supposed to be very objective, and shouldn't have like necessarily like an agenda. Well, it doesn't have an agenda, and it doesn't tell, we still give things story. Science is about collecting facts and creating laws, which are statements of like what's going to happen under a given set of circumstances. And the best we do is like this idea of theories, where we like string together these verified hypotheses and say they're unified in these ways, but there's never like a why answer in science. Like, why did life evolve? Why does this gene get passed on? Like, other than a very, very pragmatic thing. So like, why do these stories like culturally get passed on? Because they're important, because they're effective at doing whatever they do, bringing people together, bringing people joy, teaching people lessons, giving people a relationship with nature that makes them engage with it. And that's why these are so important, but it's always that it's something outside of science that gives it that why it's important.
So the folktale kind of fills in that gap. They try and answer the why to what science doesn't necessarily answer.
They do in a pretty creative way. And they're in a sense that I don't necessarily think most of the folk tales that get passed around, especially about like fearsome critters, which are like lumberjack and guide and hunter tales that like they would tell, like kind of like tall tale, Paul Bunyan-esque kind of stories. They're not moralistic. They're not about like you should do this. It's like, like this will happen if, like,
Hmm.
they are very scientific statements, albeit based maybe not so much in science and maybe more in, imagination or creative thinking, or, just another way of looking at reality.
Hmm.
I mean, depending on how you want to think about it, I guess.
And in your, your bio, you talked about how you enjoy bringing people together. And is that through um, telling folk tales, or what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I do, like, I have, like, when I'm out, like, talking and doing talks at libraries, I'll have like a top hat and a vest, and like I'll be in 1800s garb, and I actually, like, kind of channel a persona and tell stories. And so I'm really into, like, telling stories, and, of all, sometimes folk tales, sometimes stories that I've written. And that's such an important part of the human experience, like telling stories, both, like, for purely entertainment, and also, like, to get to know each other. And they're real. Sometimes we tell stories about our own lives, and
Hmm.
that's important too. But and that's one of the things, and that's, like, why I want to tell these stories of this place where I live, and this thing that was important to my family and is important to so many families in Maine, and is interesting, frankly. And also, I'm really into, like, community organization. I'm involved in a lot of, like, organizations that put on events in Bangor, Maine, where I live. I organized, I wanted to meet authors and, introduce people to books they hadn't heard of. So I put together, like, a book fair with 30 authors, and hundreds of people came. And, just because, like, that's how you bring people together. You
Hmm.
just do stuff and make things happen. And that's, when you tell stories, and people listen, and then they'll tell the stories. And that's, and it'll get people interested in what's out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when did you, so you talked about your grandfather. He was the first person to introduce you to these stories. When did that interest start rekindling?
Yeah. I mean, so, like, he told me those stories when I was little. My dad told me the stories too, which he got from my grandfather, and I assume my grandfather got them from his father and all that. But, um, and I was little when I heard those stories, and, like, I mean, then in junior high, I was really into, like, Bigfoot and Loch Ness monster, and, like, what are these mysterious creatures? And they're, like, the cryptid, that is the modern folklore. We are the folk, and that's the lore that, like, people watch and talk about.
Hmm.
And I collect a lot of folklore and stories on social media, actually, and I love hearing people's stories and experiences. And they're very like these early stories about some of these other creatures, these lumberjack creatures, the fearsome critters. But, when I picked up that book, I had kids of my own and started thinking about my grandfather's creatures again. I guess it was probably about a decade ago at this point. And so I was in my 30s, and, it just was something I found, and, was thinking that that was interesting.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, how do you feel like your love of science and folklore go together? How do they feed one another?
Yeah, I mean, science, and especially the type of science I've decided that, like, is the appropriate type for me, which is teaching,
Hmm.
and, is, it's all story. It's story about, like, what is in the world, how the world works, what might be out there, and, how do we understand the world. And so, like, to me, like, to a lot of people, they're like, how could you write a book about mythical
Hmm.
creatures and, like, all these things that are not verified by science, and you are literally a scientist. I
Yeah.
mean, I've spent, hundreds of hours, more than, looking for plants and doing ecological surveys, and, things like that. So, to me, there's no, like, all that different, like, the idea of science is only about 100 years old, like our modern conception of it, this idea that things have to be repeatable and verifiable, we have to collect this evidence to make it real,
Hmm.
is not a long-term human technology, right? Like it's not a way that we've had a relationship with the world for most of our existence, for like pretty much up until the last 4 generations. That isn't how it is. So your ancestors, our ancestors, whoever they are, they lived close to the land. Their lives depended on it as farmers, hunters, fishermen, and women. And like they had to know where these creatures would be. And when anthropologists would go places and talk to people who were not in the Western mindset where these anthropologists were, they would be like, yeah, there's moose and there's bear and the salmon run up at this time. And you got to watch out for the little people, around this pool because it's trouble. And that's really important. So don't make them mad. And that, and the water monster is over here. And like, this hairy forest giant, like, and there's these cultural things that pop up again and again and again. And, we divide cultural and psychological and imagination and spiritual and scientific, but like that's not how the world works, right? Like world is not neatly divided into these like ways of thinking about things. That's just a very modern conception. So I like reject the whole idea really that there is a boundary between those. And, these creatures are real in ways that science doesn't fully have the capacity to understand. And people get really angry when I say that sometimes,
What kind of responses
but
have you
then,
had?
well, people are just like, what do you mean these creatures are real? Like they're like insulted. And especially if they know that I am literally a scientist. And I don't mean that they're biological in that way necessarily, not in the way that we understand biological in modern science. But, like when I give, sometimes I give like a talk and I talk about like, a big part of that is what's real and like all these things that are not scientifically very verifiable that are like absolutely culturally so vital that they change the total way that we see the world and the way that we live our lives that are not testable by science outside of psychological or cultural means. I mean, like take the stock market, take religion, take our emotions towards other people. There is no way to quantify any of that. But no one says that you don't love your mom because we can't prove that. No one says the stock market isn't real, even though it goes up and down on a whim, and, like people lose $1 million in a day, $1 billion company goes out of business like that. And all that value is gone. And that value was like, so important to our culture. People are retired solely on that belief, on that cultural construct that very much becomes real and becomes a part of our world. Like stocks are real, but they are 100% not real, right? Like in an objective way.
Yeah.
And these creatures are real and they allow us to create a relationship with the world around us. And every culture has those creatures. And it's so vital, like it's an integral part of people's daily life up until the last 100 years that you have a relationship with these beings that are just in story, right? So I think stories are alive and are part of the fabric of the world, right? And it's not just folklore that's like weaving itself together. It's all of our ways of thinking and all of our ways of like understanding reality. So I'm getting really philosophical.
No, I love it. I love it. I love philosophy.
Yeah,
So go for
yeah.
it.
So, but I mean, that's like so important. I think like that's the missing. That's part of the missing piece of why these stories seem so crazy to us. And in some ways, like some of these creatures, the fearsome critters that we'll probably eventually talk about, though, if we don't, that's okay too, is like they are silly, and they do have, absolutely, you know, squishy cultural importance and ways of bringing together, people and bona fide folklore motifs and all that. But, they're cautionary stories. They're about the forest turning against the people who are like cutting it down. And
Mm-hmm.
that's like absolutely a continuation of
Mm-hmm.
the way that, say, the first people's creatures would respond to somebody who was so disrespectfully destroying everything, giving no credence to that. And so, like, of course the creatures become dark and fearsome and smash you with their heavy tail into a vaporous bloody pulp and sniff you up through their nose because they don't even have a mouth anymore. But they, that's not that different to how indigenous, wherever you're at, creatures treat people who disrespect their place of being. And then as we move out of lumberjack culture and into guide culture, the creatures become more gentle again. Which is really cool. Like, so my grandfather's creatures were a little bit creepy,
Yeah.
but mostly, like, even the same creatures that were really dangerous, like, 50 years before, are now less dangerous. They're like, you don't need to worry about them, but like, don't make them too happy or don't make them too mad, because, there's still these like literal direct cautionary statements about, the dingmaw who's in the upper right hand corner there, and, but they're no longer like, killing people that come into their territory and like, making, hunters get lost and, smashing people with the balls on their tail and things like that. They're just these features of the landscape that become like names of stones along the way of the Appalachian Trail in the White Mountains, or,
Do you
on.
do you feel like this is possibly a reaction to our removal from being within the wilderness? Like, we're outside of the wilderness and we're no longer like a part of the woods. We're like removed from it. I feel like we had a guest that came on, Nancy Marie Brown, and she talked about how in Iceland it's really common for Icelanders to believe in elves, and part of that was because they have a stronger connection to their environment, because the environment itself is so volatile and dangerous, and they really have that understanding better than a lot of city folk that are really far removed from any sort of wilderness. And I wonder if you have that take on it.
Yeah, I do. And like a lot of these creatures, like people like will say, oh, these maybe have gone extinct, right? Like the stories have been lost because we're not outside sitting around a campfire talking about these as much. And they've been replaced by like modern cryptids and like skinwalkers and Wendigo, which is actually like a really old one. Actually, they're both really old ones. And and Bigfoot and Mothman and Dogman, and which are werewolves or Luguru, and they're now like not necessarily deadly, but they're really scary, right? Like, but if you met a Wendigo, like it would eat you, like you would be dead. Like that's what all the traditional stories are about. Like it's not like, oh yeah, I saw this thing, it was super scary, it must have been a Wendigo. No, because you would be dead, right? Like that's how that worked.
Mm-hmm.
And so like this, but that doesn't mean it's not what it is, I guess. Like maybe these things change, maybe they don't. That's a really interesting one, but I'm not gonna get too far into that hole. And and then the guides had stories about Wendigos too. I've got like 1930s and 1920s stories about those in Maine and all sorts of stuff.
So
and they're different as well.
Give us an example of a creature that is different. That has the same name but has different characteristics depending on who's doing the telling.
Yeah. So there's so the Wendigo, I guess, is probably the best one because it's so like alive in our culture right now, like as a story, as like a spirit. And I don't. Are you familiar with that?
I only am familiar because it was on Sleepy Hollow, the TV show.
Sure. Yeah.
So go
Yeah.
ahead and give us a reenactment of the Wendigo.
Yeah, so Wendigo is an Algonquin cultural group, which the Wabanaki in Maine are part of. And I'm, full disclosure, I'm 100% not Native American in any way. So this is, if you want to know the real skinny about this creature, you got to go to them. But this is a spirit that is like so well established that they actually came up with like a psychological disorder that was related to this, that was in like the official codex of like the medical profession for years, and it was specific to this cultural people. And so what a Wendigo is it's a spirit. It's a cannibalistic giant, but it's not a race, it's not a creature in itself. It's a spirit that like infects people, kind of like a werewolf. Like
Mhm.
you get cursed with it, or you call the spirit into yourself because you're like crazy and evil. And or like you are a cannibal, and then you end up like being possessed by this Wendigo spirit. And you start to feel, in a lot of the traditional stories, you start to not want to eat regular food, and everywhere feels really hot because your heart becomes made of ice, ice that is, as much harder than ice as ice is harder than water. And that heart of ice changes you, and you can grow into different sizes, and will have hair and all over your body, and get so hungry, like a hunger that's like so great, and a greed that's so great, that the more you eat, the hungrier you become. And so they spend all their time like in the winter wandering around through the wilderness looking for people to eat. And they stay to the northern forests and the dark places, and they'll chew off their own lips and gnaw on their shoulders, and they're just like this horrible fearsome creature, and their howl can kill you or like stun you, or and then they'll capture you. And there's some beautiful traditional stories that are captured about like even this terrible creature that was so dangerous, and you needed to like stay away from. There's stories of like redemption in these cultural stories that are about like families surviving by like welcoming these Wendigo in and treating them like their grandfather, and they end up like sort of he's redeems himself, this Wendigo, back to his humanity. So it's very much related to this idea that like it is a separate thing, but it is a spirit that comes into you and could go away. And I'm of course not doing it justice because I'm not a part of that culture. But then people hear about this, and like often the cure for Wendigo was to kill them, right? Like there
Mhm.
were literal people that were called Wendigo hunters, and they would in these cultures, that's a thing that some of those people did. And it later, like, so as these cultures sort of became more damaged from colonization and interaction with European settlers, so like by the time I start seeing, you start seeing stories that are transmitted, passing from native cultures to Western cultures, which is in like the late 1800s is the earliest ones I've seen that aren't just like straight recordings of native people. Is like they're lumberjacks, and some of them are Native Americans, are using Wendigo, like faking Wendigo sightings. Like there's, in Legends of Our Land by Charles Skinner in the 1800s, he records this incident where these lumberjacks had taken snowshoes and put rabbit hides on the bottom and created these giant tracks that looked like they were furry, and then they dropped a drop of blood right into the center of each footprint, and that was a sure sign that it was a Wendigo. And so if you wanted to cut wood somewhere, you could do that, and then the people who were cutting there would leave, and then you could like move in. And so like he recorded that's one of the earliest like transmitted to like you know I guess like Western, like American kind of culture. And
So they were trying to
then
get people to leave so that they could cut down the forest.
Yeah, well, so not Native Americans, but like other lumbering crews.
Oh,
Like,
okay.
so like lumber crew one wants to cut where lumber crew two is already set up. So they go fake a Wendigo because you don't want to mess with them. You stay away from the forest pools where they hang out,
Hmm.
and and you don't cross their paths and things like that, as some of the folklore and that I've seen historically recorded. And they use it to actually scare them away. And then by, say, like the early 1900s, like you've got guides talking about like Wendigo as if they're like little people that like you don't cross their path, but like sometimes they'll follow you, but then they might decide to help you. And then they kind of like go away for a while, and then they become this like scary like woods demon again that we see in our modern
Yeah.
like cryptozoology like specials on History Channel or Discovery or whatever. And that you hear people talking about on social media and Reddit and all that is the stories that people tell about Wendigo now are like these scary beings that definitely have ill intent but haven't actually killed people, or like, in fact, or have they, like, and we just don't hear about it because we don't tell stories in that same way,
Uh-huh.
right? Like I mean, I don't know. But that's an example of how those stories have changed
Hmm.
over time. And there's also things where like clearly like names have been transferred from one creature to the other, and things of that sort.
So when you started writing this book, what was the purpose of writing this book, and did it change at all through the writing of the book? Um did you have something that you were trying to achieve, and did it stay the same throughout the writings, or tell us about that process?
Well, I wanted it to be like truly an all ages book, a book that like could meet you if you're a kid and you just want to look at pictures and read captions and like imagine these creatures, from whatever little snippets you read. And I did that with books when I was a kid. Or if you want to read the text, or like then look at the references or whatever and go on. So I wanted to create like a record that collected what I hoped would have been a comprehensive, and it's quite comprehensive, but I keep finding more things, and I'm working on some other volumes that will follow this, which is cool because that's the way of folklore, is there's always more, because that's how it goes. And there's always more to discover. And so I mean, that was my goal, was to like bring you know one podcast I did, its subtitle was called The Spirit of Maine, and he's like, you've got to be on this podcast because you wrote a book about the spirits of Maine, right? And I'm like, yeah, totally, that's what I want. Like, these are the things that like draw people into the place where they are,
Hmm.
is like the mystery, the spirits that live here, however they manifest, and whether it's only for a story or only an imagination, or only an imagination that you'll admit, or whether you end up with a heartfelt belief about some of these creatures. And there's creatures of all sorts. There's some that are like really joke creatures that are maybe like, spirits that are angry, and that's how they manifested, and then they turned into jokes as we deal with our humor in that joking way. But we're like, nobody could believe some of these creatures, but they do. I'm getting off of it again, off of your question, I'm sorry. So yeah, so like I just wanted people to remember the main stories, like and I think every single state could probably collect
Hmm.
folklore about creatures that have been in it. And I've been so delighted to go around the state and talk to people and have them tell me their recollections of hearing these stories, or the stories that they tell, or the experiences that they've had with some of the magical creatures, or more culturally, significant creatures that they, feel are real
So
in
who
this,
are
and
you
that are
interviewing?
real.
Who are you talking to collect these stories?
Pretty much. So I go to like a lot, I go to like festivals and book fairs, and I go to libraries, and people kind of want to hear this stuff, and like they want to know, how does a biologist write this? And so many people, like over 50% of the people, like 100, like in this country, 100% believe goats are real, and like other types of like supernatural creatures as well. And for so many people, that's like a big part of like their identity, their spirituality. And so all the people that, I'm sometimes like contacting historical societies or like going out of my way to like find an old timer, a guide that I've heard is has a story, but mostly I'm meeting people and then they're kind of interested in my book and I'm like, where are you from? Like, what kind of things have you heard of where you're, and then they're like, whoa, there's all this. And like, I get to hear a lot of people, their grandfather's stories, or, and, like like there's this one called the wedge led, or the side hill gouger, which is a creature with different length legs. They're longer on one side and shorter on the other. And so they can walk around a mountain and keep their back level, but they can only spiral around or spiral down. And so this is like a creature that's alive and well in Maine, and people still talk about it, and it's very widespread throughout the country and has been for many years. And there's lore about like things that its fat is good for, and that like, but you can't eat it, but then some people do eat it, and like how to hunt it and how to get away from it if it chases you. And some of them eat people and some of them eat rocks, and like all these different things, but they always have those different length legs, and they're a little bit scary, and you might not want to make them mad. And you got to have some, so to get away from them, you just like, you run uphill and then like get behind them and like scare them, and then they turn around and they fall over. Or you go around and like you go up and then down, and then they chase you trying to get around, and you meet them like from behind, and you can catch them that way. There's all sorts of ways to like head them off and things like that. And or if they're chasing you, you just run downhill or something like that. But then they have ways of getting around there as well. And so one person was like, my grandfather called my dad side hill gouger like for my whole life until my dad and my grandfather passed. Like, and I never knew why, this guy says to me. And he says, now that you've told me about this side hill gouger, now I know what he meant. My dad always had a limp. And so
Oh.
he had this weird walk like you would have if you had two different length legs. And so, and we're talking, there's a lot of like little people stories from different cultures that are in the book. And a lot of people have like little people stories to tell, or stories about like their grandfather or something, like, was a beaver trapper, and they would always like scope it out and make sure they were actually beavers and not little people disguised as beavers. There's some really interesting lore about that. And not in this
How would
book,
little
but
people disguise themselves as beavers? What would
well, like a lot of like creatures in Native American lore and even European lore change shape, like, or change size, and that's like a manifestation of their power, of their multiple like duality of existence, really. And it's just a way that they disguise themselves. And maybe a lot of the things we're seeing are these magical creatures in some of those stories, or maybe some of them are. And so like there's this one French little person called the Lutin. And it was always bad luck if you had like a black cat adopt your farm, or a white dog, or a yellow snake, or some odd colored animal adopt your farm. You didn't want to chase it away, because it was almost certainly one of these Lutin, that are these little people. And usually it's translated to like elf or leprechaun when it's translated to English, but they're just like a little person, like a little house elf that inhabits farms and helps you out. But they really like horses, so they ride them around, and they put braids that you can't untangle in their hair, and that's how you know for sure they're there. And there's all these like crazy ways to get rid of them. Like they're obliged to put everything back where they found it, unless you like make them really mad, and then they might like steal stuff. But so if you had one that was like causing you trouble, tiring out your favorite horse every night, you would put like a bowl of like grains on the door where they were coming in,
uh-huh.
and then they would knock it over as they came in and spill them, and then they would feel obliged to pick them up every time and put them back in there, and then eventually they would spill them and they wouldn't pick them up and they would be gone. Or you could put flour across the floor and see where they were coming in, and then you could wait and like catch them in a sack And then you had a lutein in a sack, but then if it saw you when you got rid of it, like you were in trouble. So like that was usually not the best way to get rid of them. And then my favorite is like they're really disgusted by certain behaviors. So like if you really want to make them go away, you can eat and poop at the same time, and they're like, this guy's gross, I'm out of here. And that's like in these old stories, or like do it on the manure pile, and you're like, what? Like this is like, but there's how do you live with these creatures? Because if you make them mad, they might like sew your pants up at the knee, or turn the meat in your soup to rocks or other things like that, and all sorts of things, make things go missing, bring bad weather, like ruin your crops, or let your animals out or whatever. So but they would also help you and like protect things and make things be bountiful if you had a good relationship with them. And and that's a French, Acadian, and Canadian, and legend that's like they still talk, like there's active legends in Quebec, and up in Aroostook County, which we affectionately call the county, here in Maine, which is like way up next to Canada, and where a lot of French heritage people live. So
why do you feel like these stories are worth preserving?
Well, I mean, they are like to our ancestors who were like carrying on their traditions, like they were so important that like they were things that you would absolutely tell and want to make sure that people knew their ways of being in relationship with the world, being in relationship with your ancestors and the way that they viewed the world. Because it's so easy to say, oh, look at progress, look at like, the magic of the phone that we have, that sends like invisible waves through the air and gives us access to the sum of human knowledge, on the internet at any instant, at all times. That's our magic today. But like, what are we missing by being so busy, so plugged in, so away from the world and away from each other, that we don't even have any concept of what we've lost because we're so busy doing what we're doing. And that's what people always do. But these stories are worth saving because these are gifts from our ancestors that tell us an important lesson that I don't think I fully understand, even though I've committed so much time and purpose in my life to like spreading them.
Mm-hmm.
These are things that have vital cultural information and vital, maybe spiritual or relation information with our world in environmental crisis today. We've forgotten that there's a right way to live, and we're just so busy living. And do I need 3 guitars? I don't know, probably not. But my grandfather only had one. But I mean, like I don't know, like, and I'm not telling anybody how to live, or that's but these stories do in their own way. And if we slow down and take time to find these creatures, and to share these creatures with each other, like there's something good that's going to come out of it. And I think we can all use that connection. Connection is such an important thing that stories and creatures and
We're frozen for a second. There you go.
I'm back.
Okay.
Yeah, I hope you can edit that out.
No, yeah, we can edit
If
that
not,
out.
it'd be exciting.
The
For real.
The last part I heard you say was something about connection.
Yeah, like connection is like really the crux of why we have folklore, right? Like, and like it's connection to things that we are easy to understand, like other people, our ancestors, the world around us, and its connection to like this deep past, this deep natural history and way of being and psychological and spiritual meaning that like is not obvious to us, is a thing that I think we have largely forgotten in moving, and especially as like Americans, we pick ourselves up and we've come and we have this beautiful melting pot that we've created, and that's imperfect but like always improving, just that melts all this stuff together. But our ancestral like cultures, whatever they were, you know, if they're English or French, or like I'm mostly Ukrainian, you know, other than Packard, which is like colonial mutt, I guess, from Maine. And you know, it's you know, like what have we lost like in that, and we don't know, and it's difficult. Like I don't know if anybody knows.
Hmm.
Like, and so I think this is just a way that we bring ourselves together, is sharing these stories and thinking about them and taking the time to consider them.
Yeah, that's just a beautiful way of thinking of it. So I want to read this little part that is from your intro. Uh, okay, what is it? Some might wonder how the creatures such as the ones in this book could be real and yet unknown to science. I can't fully explain the situation, though it is safe to say that these creatures live at the edge of our reality. Perhaps they live in the reflection of our world, one we can only visit in dreams and stories, or perhaps they have some special adaptation that allows them to live outside of regular space and time. And when I read that section of your intro, I immediately thought of the Outlander series. Have you read that series?
I have not.
So
No.
it's a historical fiction, and part of it is that she falls back in time through basically a stone circle, and she travels back about 200 years. And there's a section where they are in the Loch Ness area, and they talk about how their hypothesis of who Loch Ness is the Loch Ness monster, is that he's possibly falling through time just like she did. Like
Mm.
she it's sometimes visible to people and sometimes not, because somehow it's changing its time in reality. And so that was what I immediately, because that just kind of blew my mind when I read that in the book. And so I was just curious if there are ideas about um, different dimensions or realities or dream spaces, or how some people who are telling these stories view these creatures, if that is an element in any of these folk tales.
Um, yeah. I mean, first of all, I thought you were referring to Outlanders like as a book, but you're talking about the TV
Well,
show, right?
it's one and the same.
It's also a book. I've seen some of the episodes of that, so I am actually
Okay,
familiar
yeah,
with
it's
it.
originally a book
But
series, and but they made it
yeah,
into a
all
TV
great
series.
things were originally
Yeah.
book series that are on TV. Yeah, and but yeah, there are definitely hints about like every culture has this other world, but it's not another world that's separate. It's like part of our world. It's false to think, I think, about these other worlds as something separate, even like if it's a time world, you know, it's just a shadow, a space that's adjacent to but connected intimately to our world as well, you know. And so whether it's European folklore and traditional belief, and it's hard to separate that from like spiritual belief, you know, uh it's, I think, a fundamental, like there's fairyland, you know, like you step into the like ring of mushrooms and you end up in fairyland, and don't eat the food or you'll be there for 7 years and all that, you know, like that's you know, and you come back mad, or you come back like despondent, never able to live in the regular world. And then there's like echoes of similar themes, you know, distinct but like related things about like going into the world below or the world above, and these Algonquin stories, at least the way they were translated originally, that, you know, the Wabanaki in Maine have talked about and do talk about because they're still here. And you know, of course, like all around the world, I think that's a way that we understand understand the world as people. And it's really, again, just like this scientific thing that we have this one reality, this one life in this one way, and only things that we can test and touch and observe directly, or through our phones apparently is also directly measuring, the invisible waves that they pick up. Like there are hidden worlds that are outside of our perception that we know all about. And we find more all the
What do you
time. And
mean?
of course, like, well, like, I mean, like, there was not so long ago that we couldn't send, like microwave messages to our phones to be able to communicate with other people, with those invisible, undetectable, harmless, long wavelength waves that, we don't have a biological ability to detect, but they're absolutely real. And then, of course, like, you always see people talking about like what the frontiers of science, like the weirdness that happens in quantum states, like where you have like entanglement, like where you do something to this particle and this particle over here, responds even though they have no basis for physical connection. It's called entanglement. And you've got the idea that electrons are both the particle or a wave, depending on if you're watching them, they're a particle, and they're a wave if you stop watching them, or forget you were watching them. That they change their behavior and their physical features in the way they work in our world. And like, I'm not saying like those other fairy worlds or dream time, or like, the world, these other worlds or times or whatever is related to quantum stuff or not. I'm totally agnostic about how science relates to all this stuff. Science is doing what science is doing, and these stories have been around for millennia and all of our generations. So they're real, and there are people who experience those all the time through, that, like, those experiences that they have. Like, people are always like, I saw what I saw, like whatever you think I saw, like, I don't care, like this was a real thing. And there are, all sorts of like fairly well understood like spiritual practices that people have that like allow them to, work with what they might refer to as like other dimensions or like other worlds. I don't think the people practicing would call it that, but like shamanic culture and things like that, like, have these journeys from the body where they fight things and encounter spirits that are absolutely real and like part of our world and affect our world, and they're just a different way of looking at it. And those are like, like, shamanic stuff comes from like specific cultures, but like there's these animistic themes that anthropologists recognize that have been part of all cultures or pretty much all cultures that we can figure out, for so many years, until we sort of give it up or change it or trade it for science or like whatever way that we want to, we start thinking about the world as we leave our traditional culture, or some other culture comes into that and replaces it with another economic and social system, but these remnants, these fragments, these story echoes are those lessons, those gems that our ancestors have rolled to us from the past, that we can choose to pick up and, see what we look like in, when we gaze on those stories or those experiences. And I think there are ways to like delve into that more if that's what you're interested in, or you can just appreciate them as a beautiful cultural story that brings people together and connects them with the world and makes them think deeply about who they are as a person. And whatever the meaning for them is, for whoever is experiencing these stories, that's the important part, right? Like, stories are for whoever hears them, right? That's
And what meaning they
in my
garner from them.
Yeah, and the longer we spend with them, the more meaning we garner from them, and I mean, yeah. So I don't know if it's 100% subjective, but it's definitely whatever we experience is always through the lens of our experiences and cultural experiences that we've built up over our life.
Absolutely. So let's dive into some of the tellers of these stories. So you talked about in your intro, there are 5 nations of native tribes that are a lot of the folk tales that are in your book are the originators of. Is that right?
Yeah, well, so the Wabanaki people are 5 nations from south to north. They would be the Abenaki, the Penobscot, the Passamaquoddy, the Maliseet, and Micmac, or Mi'kmaq, I guess is the correct pronunciation. And they, of course, are the people who have had the relationship with this land the longest,
Mhm.
and their stories were obviously here first. And to ignore those stories would, of course, be doing a horrible injustice to those spirits that are in those stories, and the those people who had those stories to tell, because they interacted with other people. And so those the native people who live here, of course, had stories, and they shared them, and they were recorded by anthropologists. And and I have native friends, and I've had experiences with people, and I kind of consciously left out, like, I want people to like learn the native stories from native people, because it's so frequently like been that like other people tell their stories, but I also felt like it would be a huge injustice to leave them out. And so like I don't tell the stories, but I tell about the spirits that you might meet here in Maine, so that if you wanted to find out more, you could go to those native people. And so those are a really important source, I think, of understanding like what the spirits of Maine and the folk tales and and folklore are, because they're the backdrop of the people who came here, as colonially from Europe, how they started to experience the world and understood, and who taught them about this new place that they were in. And of course, a lot of antagonism between those peoples in early times. But then you get, do you want me to go on? Do you want me to
Oh,
delve into that
yeah.
anymore?
Well, I
Or?
was just gonna say, when you say spirits, do you mean like the spirit of the story, or this actual physical spirits that are haunting the forest, or what do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean it all. I reject that there's a boundary between the two. I mean, like, if, the tellers of those stories were like, here's a thing that happened, they're legends. Like the language, the Algonquin language has conjugations for like distant past and like immediately present things, and locative, like that this is a location oriented thing. And like, so the language that they seem to have used to tell these stories to the anthropologists was not the creatures in this book. While some occur in the distant past, they're in the book, because they have, they're talked about as if, as being real, as being things that you can encounter. And like, Paul Bunyan is a great example, to skip to a different culture. Like, the early anthropologists who studied the lumberjacks telling that are like, these stories are like, the anthropologists are like, these stories are absolutely fake, they're made up, there's no person named Paul Bunyan. And then like, but they're like, the lumberjacks will swear forever and never say that he's fake. They will in fact claim that they worked with them 2 seasons
Mm.
ago, and like was in his camp, and like saw some of these things. And like, a lot of like the lumberjack tales that we see are literary tales that were passed down, or like cleaned up, because lumberjacks are pretty rough fellas. Like, they were like, they were pretty rude and like rough, and like, totally inappropriate, I think. And as like guys joking around, if they're like hanging out not showering for, in a one room building,
Like they're very crude
and
or
working.
sexual, or in what sense?
Yes, everything, all of it. And but like all the like all the sexual stuff is like cleaned out of the stories, I think, by the, and they'll even write like this is the, and then there was some details that are not appropriate, like the anthropologist that to record, and you're like, what, like this is a science, supposedly a scientific study of culture, like how can you not record what they were saying?
Yeah.
But like, I mean, it's just like the time they're in, like that would be totally inappropriate. And so like, everything is through culture, like it's this invincible lens. My minor in college was anthropology, so so I have like this strong, like I think culture is like the glasses through which we see the world. Like it totally changes like how we interpret everything.
Absolutely.
And so, and it's real, right? Like you can't be like culture is not real. It's like 1000% real to our experience. And, so like whatever it does, like it's just doing its best. Like, I mean, and people are, and not to make excuses for anybody for whatever, but I mean, that's how it is. So yeah, I mean, spirits of the story, and I mean, like they're talked about as real. And so who am I to say that's just a story?
Yeah. Do you have
like,
an example of one?
I mean, like the Wendigo we were talking about earlier, there's a host of little people that get talked about, like, little 3 foot, 1 foot, 2 foot, like people that, these different races and different ways to interact with them in these stories, so anthropologists like separate and a lot of times like folklorists, like legends from like just folk tales. Like folk tales are like just stories, and like legends are things that are told as true. Right. And it doesn't mean they're not true or like are true. It's just like that is the teller's like interpretation of this story, is it's true. And like it's completely inappropriate, I think, to say that those stories are false. And like, because I'm a scientist, so like I'm collecting cultural information. It's absolutely real. And I mean, I've had some weird experiences, in my life. So like, I mean, things that people would think are crazy, like ghosts and stuff like that. And I mean, I'm not going to tell those stories now, but like, who am I to tell somebody what their reality is, or what their, and stories, like, especially with Indigenous people, are so tied up in spirituality because they're still in their culture, right? Like they're not like removed, they're not like changed religion through conversion 1,000 years ago or 100 generations or whatever, so like the separations that we make between story and reality and religion and nature are like not real for, I think, Indigenous people in a traditional sense. But you would have to ask somebody who was living that to really know. And I'm not sure the question makes sense to somebody who's living that. Like it's an absurd question. Like, what do you mean these things are separate, right? Like, and I think if you go far enough back to somebody who's living like whatever this place-based culture that they had been, like, in that way, non-civilized, I guess, as we might say today, I think the question doesn't make any sense. But to us, like we want to know, is it this or is it this? And I'm saying like, yes, it's those things. Right. And that makes people mad sometimes.
Yes.
Like, I don't think I'm making you mad, but like there's no line.
Right.
Like that line is fake. We made it up.
Right.
It's a story. Like that's the story that we're telling.
It's our cultural perception.
Because it's our culture. Yeah. Right. And so, and I'll do that for like all of the creatures in here are real, like, and because they're told as true, or they wouldn't be in that book. And some of them are absolutely silly, but it doesn't mean you can't have experiences with them. So, like, whatever that means.
So we talked a little bit about the First Nations people. What about the French and the English people who came over? What stories did they bring over, and how did they change once they were in Maine or in that region?
Yeah. So there's two waves of French people that come over. The very first people were Acadians, and so like our national park that's in Maine, Acadia, is named for them. Where there was an important French admiral, general, whatever, named Cadillac, who had a colony there, and then it was like this was New France, where I am right now, and and it was all part of Quebec, and Nova Scotia was part of that, and New Brunswick, and all that. And then, of course, the British came. So, like, the French stories are, I think, a lot more intact. Like as like a folklorist hat, like as far as like traditional, like what is similar to like French stories. And I write a little bit about this in this book, like talking about some of that, but it isn't a huge part of my study. And so, like, you'll hear a lot of like the Luton stories and the Loup-garou, like those stories basically come over, and they're regional within French, so within France. So it's sometimes difficult to tell, like, is this a change story, or is that just like from Provence, and or like Brittany, and not like Paris. I mean, like, because they're different, because they're living these sort of more or less very agrarian, like the type of people that come over, like what is their relationship with the land and their traditional stories. And the type of English people that come over is actually quite different. It tends to be the people who write about the English things come over and then set up education systems. Like, basically the English stories are more or less like lost, like whatever came over. There's like a few things. There's this little person that like haunts lumberjack camps called Sock Saunders, and he would cause all sorts of accidents, tying up logging chains and pushing trees the wrong way and letting the horses go, kind of like the Lutin. But, and they would, talk about, you didn't give me that time, Sock Saunders. And apparently this was like a big deal for some period of time, this named creature, little person, in all these various camps, or at least a few camps. And but mostly you hear like the transcendental writers like Thoreau and Emerson and Whittier, like, and Longfellow, just literally saying like these English stories do not come over, like there aren't fairy stories. But then you'll see like little snippets where like they're like, man, like this, some educated guy ends up in like down East Maine, which is like the, way out towards Canada coastal part. Um, and they start talking about, how, everybody here believes in witches and goblins and imps and fairies, and it's just total chaos, right? And, and you talk to Michelle Shore, and there's like ghost stories and orbs and things like that, and that are around, but like it doesn't survive in the literature. Whereas the French who were here, there was a lot of like, they, and like the Native Americans, like they became insular communities because of linguistic and cultural barriers. There's actually a lot of discrimination against French people because
Mm-hmm.
like we actually went to, Maine is the only state that's gone to war with another country all by itself. It was called the Aroostook War, and we declared war on Canada over like the county, which is a French region of Maine, like, and who got it. And Canada, I think like the King of Sweden, ultimately like negotiated the new border, and like we got the southern half that's Maine, and they got the New Brunswick portion.
Oh, interesting.
And that's Acadian people, which is not Quebecois, which is like a later French arriving people, though Acadians did end up in Quebec, but they got sort of like over. And so there were multiple pulses of these sort of rural, like old timey kind of stories. And you see some of that kind of stuff survive in like Labrador, which is like a Canadian province that's like way up north of here. And you'll see some fairy stories that survive there because like there isn't like cultural centers in Labrador. It's like like there's nothing there. They would probably be mad at me for saying that, but they can't find me because I'm down here. And so, like I think they existed, but they didn't get passed on because of the cultural, like the way we melt America.
Mhm.
And so if you have an easy to see difference, like you tend to be isolated, and then your cultural stories survive for longer periods of time, more intact.
I
Um,
see. Yeah.
and and oral storytelling maintains a larger part of like the culture to some extent.
Hmm.
I think, and it gets replaced with like literature as you become part of this like sort of like homogenized American culture. And I'm not bashing, like I love America, it's great, but like we what have we sacrificed to create this place,
Hmm.
and like we don't know, like you and I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe you do. I don't. I would like to, and that's why I do this. And and so like you lose a lot of that. And then like Irish and Scottish people come, and like there's some interesting writings about like there's this creature in the book called the phantom or the specter moose. It's this giant, like twice the size of like a regular moose, and it's like white, and you can't shoot it, or if you shoot it, it like comes back to life. And there's like all sorts of cool stories about it. And it goes back to the 1800s, but the original stories are like, oh, this is just like some Irish guy, like was talking about it. Nobody believes, like they're as unbelievable as the French. And you're like, what? And then some hunter sees it, who's like they call them rusticators or sports, who come up from southern New England, and sees it, and they're like, oh, it is real. Like, and you're like, this is so interesting. And so there's always these like pieces that you find that are like, you know and so like in a sense, like your culture stays more intact the more isolated you are from the dominant culture. And I think that's pretty
Hmm.
common like around the world, for better or for worse. And it's probably also tied to it's definitely tied to discrimination as well. But the benefit is you keep your culture, and you keep this face-to-face culture a little bit longer
Hmm.
than the dominant culture did, and that has its own benefits, to some extent. That certainly doesn't make up for, like justifying discrimination or anything like that. But, so.
Do you have a personal favorite of the mythical creatures?
No offense, but my least favorite question, because I love them
You love
all.
them all.
They're, yeah, that which is the worst possible answer. I love, like, I guess the two like types of creatures that I love the most are like, I love little people, like
Mm.
little magical, like elves, dwarves, and like whatever indigenous or Luthen or like Sock Saunders. Like the idea that these little house elves, or forest elves live and interact with us and have a way of disappearing and stepping into another world and like helping or hindering us depending on that I love. And you know when I was younger, I had like a weird experience that I kind of think of as a little people experience. And so I love those stories and how universal they are.
Mm.
I also love the overall fearsome critters, the lumberjack and guide critters, like the dingmaul or plunkus, or like my grandfather called, and this is the same creature, the pelton thumper, this big like cat, otter headed, short necked, like low to the ground, like big cat with a giant long thick tail and a big hard ball on its tail that it could swing around and like attack people with for defense, or break the ice, or break a dam, or knock down trees, or splinter them up, or like bang on its mate to make sure it's got a strong one, with this big, bristly, bony ball on its tail. Like I love those because those are the ones that like drew me into this and called me to do this work, these fearsome critters, these guide and lumberjack and hunter stories, and the side hill gougers and the wedge ledge chompers and the philomaloo birds, and just these unfortunate and like scary and like funny creatures that are really a reflection of our relationship with the forest, and for lumberjacks are often scary and dangerous, and for guides are a little bit dangerous if you don't know what you're
Mm.
doing, and then like become a little bit funny, and are still talked about here in Maine, and I love that. So I love those living pieces of folklore. Like, and there's less and less each year, I think,
Mm.
and so but I like these, and I like telling the stories, and I always am like, now you tell these stories,
Right.
like 'cause that's and that's how these live on, right?
Do you see one as the most unique to Maine?
Mm. Um, the fearsome critters in general like start in Maine, and of course all the Wabanaki creatures are pretty unique to like this region, northern New England and maritime Canada. But it, I think I can't think of any that are like truly. I mean, you've got like the Tote Road Shagama. I think that one's only in Maine or started out in Maine. There's a lot of them that started out in Maine, but then they make their way to the upper Midwest and and down south
So
and things
what is
like
that
that.
one? The Totemash.
Oh, the Tote Road Shagama. Well, he's a tough one. He's real imitative. He's half moose and half bear, and that's not to say he looks like a half bear and half moose. He's kind of a bipedal, walks on two legs creatures, very curious, sort of an innocent like face, walks upright, but he gets tired every quarter mile or so. He switches legs from the moose legs on his back to walk on his front legs, which look like bear paws. And it's very, there's no greater, embarrassment than coming into camp and not knowing whether you're tracking a moose or a bear. And they tend to like pick up loose things that they find, like, so if your coat's gone missing or your pants, like it was probably the Tote Road Shagama that picked them up. And they're called tote road shagamas because the shagama likes to follow a tote road, which everybody knows is the road that you tote the logs out on, a woods road. And like a surveyor, they watch what people are doing and they follow the same paths. They follow surveyors, and every quarter of a mile, which is the chain links on a surveyor's chain, they'll actually switch their legs. And when they find a witness tree or a property corner, they'll actually circle it and pay homage to it before they continue on. So they tend to like repeat those. And it's kind of my hypothesis that we don't do a lot of that surveying in that old fashioned way, or like we don't have boots on the ground doing logging anymore. It's machines. And so here we've got the Appalachian Trail, and so there's these people called through hikers which hike from Georgia to Maine or Maine to Georgia, and they look pretty shaggy by the end, just like a tote road shagama might. And things go missing sometimes, and it's a little hard to tell. Is that a through hiker passing through town, or is that a shagama? And there's a lot of creatures like that have kind of stories that go along with them and kind of explain silly things and things to look out for. So, and that's the Tote Road Shagama.
And so, what has surprised you the most during this work?
Um, Surprised me the most, I guess what really surprised me was how the stories like linked together, and like how like Willow the Wisp, which is like a floating orb that leads people astray, like in French Canadian, that's fée follet. And that changes into like the philomaloo bird, like this like horrible like distortion of the French language, that there's this glowing nocturnal bird that would fly around, it like changes. And then like I find another story that like, oh, it's a bird, but it flies backwards. and it's brightly colored, and it doesn't like bridges, which is another like will-o'-the-wisp French Canadian story. And so now you've got a Philomelou bird that's like lays square eggs and flies backwards because it doesn't care where it's going, it only cares where it's been. And you got to watch out for them. And if everyone's chasing you, you just cross a bridge and you can't get after you. But that relates to like the French Canadian fée follet. These sort of, if you were real bad and you didn't go to mass for 7 years, you might turn into a loup-garou, which means you'd turn into a wolf each night. And if
Oh.
you weren't saved for another 7 years of being a loup-garou, if you truly didn't repent or use the name of God, or nobody drew your blood to cure you of this curse, you'd turn into a will-o'-the-wisp, a fée follet, a flying fire. And they would chase people. And the way to get rid of them, is you can't attack those directly like the loup-garou. You can just draw its blood and it'll turn back into a person, but actually cure them of the curse. But the fée follet, you have to find the person who it's come out of, and it's come out of their mouth, and you have to flip them over, and then it can't get back in. And or you can find a crook in a tree and you can jump through, and if you put your knife in there, they can't get through the same way that they follow you. And so this creature that was like scary and would chase people and lead them astray, or like related to a werewolf and related to like violating cultural norms of good religion, like turns into this lumberjack creature that's this backwards flying bird that is now known across the country. And I like found these records where it literally, you can see it changing from one thing into the other, and it doesn't make any of them not
Mm-hmm.
real. It just makes them alive, the way that they evolve as a story and get seen, how they're important and what kind of information they transmit, and the way that we relate to them. So, I mean, that's the kind of thing that I didn't expect to see. I mean, like I thought anthropology was a little bit interesting in school, but biology was my real jam. And like animals, you can't really watch them easily change and evolve
Mm-hmm.
like in a human life or a generation or two, but our stories, our oral stories do. And spirits don't follow the same rules of the way of being. So it doesn't negate them as being real. Like we see things as like fixed, this is this and it will always be this, but like that's not how like ancestral knowledge treats the world. Everything is cyclic, everything is changing. Like the rivers don't stay the same. Like that's a terrible idea. When we try and like make the straight river, it's just going to get out, right?
Mm-hmm.
But like everybody knows rivers move around and change and seasonally are different, and like a floodplain is literally part of the river. It's supposed to be part of it. And like these are like ancestral pieces that like it doesn't mean anything. That doesn't mean it's not real if our nature changes. Like if you have an existence as a man and then you have an existence as a wolf at night, all because you violated cultural norms, and then you find out who the loup-garou is, and then you're not allowed to tell anybody for whatever reason that I don't understand. Like who was the loup-garou, and so like that's the surprising stuff, is like the stuff that's so like like watching it change, watching it be connected as our culture
Mm-hmm.
changes. And I had somebody say, like, well, spirits just appear to us in whatever way we can
Mm-hmm.
understand, like it's like through our own cultural glasses. And so like I guess I do, like I wasn't ready to see how much things can change, but like how they can like have a same identity as they pass
Mm.
down. So I don't know if that
Yeah,
makes any sense, but
absolutely. So, what do you want the readers or the listeners of this podcast to take away from your book or this particular episode about fearsome creatures?
yeah. Yeah, well, the stories are all around us, and that like we like fearsome critters are like truly American culture, right? Like, and they are funny and they test our bravery and they teach us lessons and they are scary and they bring us together. And so what I want people to do is like find those stories of your
Mm.
place wherever you're at and learn them and tell them and take the time to like reflect on them and look for those creatures and then share them with other people. And whenever I sign a book, I always write all these stories are true, right? And always tell your, and then I tell people like always tell your
Mm.
story. And like don't be ashamed of however you view the world. Like share your story, your experience, and also share these, and don't accept that there are lines of how things are supposed
Mhm.
to be, because that's not how things work, right? Like things change and move, and that's good. That means they're alive, right? When they don't, they're
Yeah,
dead.
absolutely.
And yeah, so always tell your story and follow the stories, find the truth, right?
Well, that's just, yeah, I think this is a great place to end unless there's something that we've missed. Is there something that we've missed in this episode?
No, no, you got me to talk
Mm.
about like all sorts of things. Other than I was like, I'm only going to talk about fearsome critters because that's the book I'm working on. But then like I can't not talk about all the creatures that are in the book, because you got to tell the
Yeah.
story. So I think that's great. We went all the directions.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much for joining us on Fabric of Folklore.
All right,
And
thank
thank
you.
you, folksy folks, for listening. We will have all of the links that we talked about on the show up on our website, www.fabricoffolklore.com. And if you have a question that I didn't ask, or if you have comments, we have a Facebook community page to continue the conversation. So, what did you think about the episode? What fearsome critters had you heard about? Had you heard about the Maine folklore mythical creatures? We want to hear from you, and that is where you can continue this conversation. Um, and if you enjoyed today's episode, please, please, please remember to subscribe, share, comment, and like and review us. Because, like I said in the intro, that is how people find our show. If you are reviewing our show and you're giving us all the stars, then that is how other people find our show. And the more people who watch and listen to the show, uh, the better, right? Because the more interconnected we are, and the better we understand one another. So thanks for joining us on Fabric of Folklore, where we unravel the mysteries of folklore. Once again, my name is Vanessa Y. Rogers, and until next time, keep the folk alive.